Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to SciTech Darsbury. It's a great pleasure to have this meeting here. I think you know probably what we're about here within SciTech Darsbury. We certainly we have engineering at our core. You know, we have been working on big science. Predominantly here it's engineering and technology and high performance computing. And both of these, I think, are highly relevant to this meeting. Obviously, the engineering and technology we do has a huge focus on accelerators with the work of Cockcroft and Aztec, but also the high-performance computing is more and more getting applied to the real world of business and industry. And of course, accelerators are at the heart of business, industry and society in many, many areas. So it's great that we can congregate our engineers and technologists across not just our large-scale facilities, but industry and the applications of accelerators and have this sort of meeting. So I think John Womersley is going to kick off the meeting, giving us a talk about the UK programme.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan. So I'm the Chief Executive of STFC. STFC owns and operates Daresbury Laboratory, and we're a partner in the broader SciTech Daresbury campus. And as many of you know, we are the stewards of large accelerator-based facilities, both in the UK and the UK's participation in international facilities. I was actually asked to do more than sort of an inspirational introduction into why accelerators are fun and important, and sort of lay out what our priorities are and what we see as the major strands of development, which proved to be a little more contentious than one might have thought. But the intention is that this talk actually contains real information. And so I hope it is more than a series of platitudes about all the good things we could do, and it's actually supposed to guide us in terms of what we see as the highest priorities for investment over the next few years, which is really critical in a budgetarily constrained environment, which we're all in. If we don't know what our priorities are, we'll probably spend a lot of time and effort pursuing many things that will never reach fruition. So, again, a little bit more about STFC. We're one of the UK research councils. That means we have a royal charter in an office in Swindon. There is a piece of parchment hanging up with Elizabeth R at the bottom, saying we establish a Science and Technology Facilities Council to promote scientific research through the following. And this is a sort of summary of what it then says. We support university-based research and skills in astronomy and particle and nuclear physics, and certainly the particle and nuclear physics, the promotion of understanding of the universe and the properties of matter in those areas depends very strongly on particle accelerators as a key tool. We build and develop national science and innovation campuses around our national laboratories. Well, here you are in one of those two locations, the other one being Harwell in Oxfordshire. Those promote academic and industrial collaboration. The Cockcroft Institute here on this site, which you will have come past as you entered the lab, is a key example of that, bringing together STFC's own Accelerator Science and Technology Department with scientists and engineers from Lancaster, Manchester, and Liverpool in the pursuit of accelerator science and technology and its applications. And then thirdly, we provide access to world-leading large-scale research facilities. Think of CERN as the prime example there. Again, highly dependent upon particle accelerator technology and its continued advancement. So, driving us, because we are a research council, is a scientific mission. And when you think of particle accelerators, you probably normally first think of particle physics. And indeed, that's where accelerators came from, originally in the 1950s. Actually, I suppose electrostatic accelerators before that, as a way of accelerating particles to sufficiently high energies to probe the internal structure of other fundamental particles and ultimately to create new ones. This continues to drive our fundamental understanding of the universe, but it also continues to have very broad impact across all of society. 90% of physics students say they were attracted to study. I don't know if this applies to those of us in the audience. Maybe we should do an impromptu poll. But what we've done with the Institute of Physics says that 90% of physics students originally got interested in either astronomy or particle physics, trying to understand the fundamental questions like where do we come from, where are we going, why is the universe here? The Higgs boson discovery in 2012 is an example of that, the science story for the UK of this decade so far. Nobel Prize awarded the year after. This lovely guy who had spent 50 years waiting for his theories to be confirmed when particle accelerator technology finally was able to deliver sufficient energies and intensity of particle collisions to verify his view. We got to 26 million people in the UK with that story, so third of the total population, talking about particle accelerators and how they have helped us understand the fundamental structure of the universe. I was on a NERC, an Environmental Research Council oceanographic ship last night, and talking to some of the NERC staff, including a guy they brought on board, sorry, not that was a bad pun, brought on to look at their communication strategy and how they communicate the value of the research that NERC funds. And you might think environmental research, climate change, things like that were very easy to explain to the public and very simple to communicate. And he was saying, no, what we are looking for is what is our CERN? We want a big flagship thing that everybody can relate to. So we shouldn't underestimate the interest in accessibility, surprising accessibility of this stuff. But of course, that's only part of what we do. Particle accelerators also underpin light sources and neutron sources that are used for very multidisciplinary science. We operate national facilities in each of those categories, and we are partners in the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility in Grenoble. We're also joining a couple of new international facilities, which I'll talk about in a moment. And these support experiments in biomedical science, material science, chemistry, pharma, fundamental biochemistry, cell biology, and so on. And a lot of these have strong connections, as Susan said, to computational and data analysis. There's thousands of researchers in the UK who are using these things across this very, very broad range of interdisciplinary science. Now, we do have a strategy in these areas, and I want to emphasize that because this sort of technology at the interface between fundamental science and engineering, which is where you all sit, is not entirely driven by the best proposal that we get from an academic group. That may be the way that you develop material science or biochemical research, by calling for proposals from individual scientists. Here we need a bit more guidance because the projects are big and we need to invest at the appropriate level, so we need to set some direction. And so we've tried to do this across the whole breadth of STFC's technology portfolio. But all of these precepts apply perhaps as a prototype to accelerators. We'll develop this kind of technology first and foremost to underpin our future big science facilities, international and national. We'll strategically manage a program then with that goal, rather than hoping that by good chance it works out. If you need a certain technology, you've got to be willing to support it. And that's not to do with maximizing the number of publications in the scientific literature, though it's nice if that's a byproduct. And thirdly, having developed key technologies, we will try to promote their application more broadly. So we see our current and future scientific facilities as a stimulant of new development and R&D, but not the only consumer of that. So let me give you some examples. So light sources, X-ray light sources, which have a long history going back here at Daresbury to the first one that was built and whose components you can see outside there, followed by the SRS, and eventually supplanted by the diamond light source at the Harwell site. The largest scientific investment in the UK for many, many decades, and something of a flagship, is still being outfitted with additional beamlines, and it aims to be the best medium energy X-ray source in the world, complementing the much higher energy, the somewhat higher energy synchrotron at ESRF. The flagship killer application for X-ray synchrotron light sources like this is structural biology, understanding the atomic structure of macromolecules like this, I think that's the foot and mouth disease virus, and this protein, which is, the complex folding of which leads potentially to disease and to the design of drugs to address it. Now, diamond may be the current state of the art, but the emerging state of the art is a class of complementary facilities which will not replace, but which will add to what you can do at synchrotron X-ray sources. And so we've identified, with advice from our science community and our science board, an accelerator-driven free electron laser light source is our highest priority for a new accelerator-based facility. So this would be, and we'll hear more about this in subsequent talks today, this would be an electron linac feeding an undulator system which will generate highly coherent and very bright and very short pulses of X radiation. In a synchrotron facility like this, you make these images through computational analysis of the data that comes off, but you don't take a single macromolecule like that and attempt to make an image of it, you crystallize it. So you create a coherent scatter of a very large number, approaching Avogadro's number of such objects that are all lined up and oriented the same way. That means if you can't make the bloody thing crystallize, you're in trouble. And a lot of the key biomolecules to do with cell membranes, for example, are very hard to crystallize. So there is great interest in ways to produce a coherent beam of X-rays that will then reduce the need for a coherent lattice off which to scatter. So you can get a bright scattering off a much smaller crystal, nanoscale crystals, and ultimately the holy grail would be off single molecules, though we're a long way from achieving that yet. So there are already facilities of this class in operation. In Stanford in the United States, for example, there is a major European facility called the European XFEL under construction now in Hamburg, and the UK is committed to be part of that. And ultimately, we have the dream, aspiration, goal, whatever, of a UK-based facility of that type, because other major countries are investing in such things, for example, the Swiss, and we can see that this is a gap in our portfolio of analytic facilities. So as a step towards that, you'll hear about Clara as a technology testbed being built here at Daresbury, and you'll hear about where that will lead. We're also collaborating with the Swiss on their SwissFEL project and participating in the UK participation in the European XFEL. But of course, it's not the end of the line for circular synchrotron-based facilities. There are new lattice concepts which will dramatically increase the brightness that can be achieved from the synchrotron source, and we wish to continue to diamond light source to take advantage of such innovation. Clara, shown here, not a modest goal purely for a test facility. The first 30 meters or so are currently under construction, as you can see here, real engineering. The remainder we hope to be able to support pending sufficient capital funding in the current government spending review. And this is a testbed facility for that technology, but with other applications too. European XFEL is a much larger machine, several kilometers long, taking electron beam from the existing DAISY laboratory, directing it towards the northwest into the German state of Schleswig-Holstein, and then producing X-ray beams on laboratory building here. And as you can see, they've finished tunneling, and in fact, I think now they're starting to install equipment in that tunnel. Now, complementing what you can do with X-rays generated by stored electron beams, we have a portfolio of neutron scattering, which uses a proton accelerator directed onto a target to produce beams, or a spray more, of neutrons. And ISIS is the prototype facility of this class, a spallation neutron source, an accelerator-driven neutron source, where a heavy metal target inside this concrete vault is irradiated with a 200 kilowatt proton beam in this case. That produces evaporation of neutrons off the outer shell layers in the nuclei. Those neutrons can be moderated in plastic or helium material to slow them down and give a more uniform and coherent beam, and that beam is then used to study the structure of materials. So the killer app, the poster child for neutron scattering, is engineering structures, looking at the stresses in metal components like this. This is an Airbus A380 wing spar, which has been assembled with room temperature welding technology, and Airbus want to understand what the residual stresses are in that after it's been flexed, corresponding to thousands of takeoffs and landings. And you can do that with real full-size engineering components, and neutron scattering, because it sees the nuclei and not the atomic orbitals, is the key way to do that. So we're continuing, again, to develop ISIS predominantly in instrumentation and target capabilities, but with a rolling program of accelerator upgrades, which I'll talk about in a minute. Yeah, well, here we are. So our priority for accelerator-based neutron sources in the UK is not a brand new facility, in contrast to what we're thinking may be necessary in light sources, because ISIS is very much the current state of the art. But it won't stay there if we don't continue to invest. So we have a rolling program of upgrades that are at the 10 to 15 million pound level individually to keep this facility at the cutting edge. And that includes new LINAC, proton source, upgrades to the target and moderator systems, and upgrades to the instrumentation. In the longer term, I would not want to rule out more major upgrade to ISIS that might take it from the hundreds of kilowatts to the megawatts of beam with new target and entirely new capabilities. But that's not a priority in the short term, and that would have to follow a decision on an investment in an X-ray FEL. But we should not close that off. And we're continuing, therefore, to invest in understanding the technology that we need for this rolling program of upgrades to maintain the capability of our neutron source through front-end test stand, which is shown schematically here and which is installed at the Rutherford Lab in collaboration with the institutes that are shown there. The next generation neutron scattering facility in Europe, some analog, if you like, of the European XFEL, is the European Spallation Source. You'll hear a talk later today about some of the work that we are doing to contribute to ESS. ESS is a megawatt class, multi-megawatt class proton accelerator driving a target which is contained in this vault. In contrast to ISIS, it is a longer pulse machine, which makes the handling of that high power easier, but it also limits some of the scientific capability. So there is a long-term complementarity between ISIS and ESS. This is not going to replace ISIS, but it places different demands on the accelerators and the instrumentation. We are part of this. The UK is part of this, but we want to maximize the investment that we make in this country, in industry, in the universities, in the institutes here. So we're looking for in-kind contributions. Unfortunately, a lot of the particle accelerator design for ESS has already been done and involves other European laboratories. So our scope to do this is less than we would have liked, and that's one of the lessons about not getting into projects later in their life cycle, but we had no choice here. All right, so back to this guy. Peter Higgs looking a little bit bemused and surprised. Nobel Prize winner for his prediction of the Higgs particle, discovered with the machine behind him. He's really in the tunnel. It looks a bit photoshopped, but no, he's actually there. The Large Hadron Collider, which, as you all know, I hope is now operating again at 13 TeV collision energy, having been upgraded and enhanced over the last couple of years, and which is once again delivering physics. This will be a long run of the LHC at its full energy, followed by an upgrade to higher luminosities, followed by, again, much long running. So for the next decade and a half, the physics program at CERN is focused on, again, a series of ongoing upgrades and enhancements to the current major infrastructure. They're not small upgrades and enhancements. The LHC luminosity upgrade is a billion Swiss franc project, but it involves rebuilding something like 1 or 2 kilometers of the 27-kilometer machine, not a complete reconstruction of the entire thing. And that's part of the European strategy for particle physics, which is entirely aligned with, derived from, or drives STFC's strategy for particle physics, partly because we were all part of the drafting team that wrote it. So the high luminosity LHC upgrade, followed by a long period of exploitation, is the highest priority, and it's already receiving substantial investment from CERN. But it's not the only thing listed. And the other things are perhaps a little bit more interesting because they go beyond. So the European strategy for the first time talks explicitly about projects outside Europe, and it highlights the desire to have a coordinated European investment in long baseline neutrino facilities outside Europe. And it's a little bit coy about where that would be. There are two obvious locations: Fermilab, which is pushing ahead very ambitiously with a new high-energy neutrino beam that would be directed west from Illinois towards an underground laboratory in South Dakota, and Japan, where there's an existing experiment, T2K, that already has substantial European involvement and where there are fairly ambitious plans to upgrade. Neither of these has secured funding from their respective national funding agencies yet, though the US project is quite advanced. All of them are actively seeking international participation, and all of them would like strong UK involvement. So I think there is an opportunity here, if we can identify the key UK strengths, as that last bullet point says, and if we can secure appropriate funding to do that. The challenges for neutrino experiments are, of course, generation of a sufficiently high energy proton beam and then directing that onto a target, which would otherwise get destroyed by the beam, holding that target together, producing secondary particles which then decay to make the neutrino beam in a sufficiently collimated way. The third thing in the European strategy, which is interesting, is for the first time to start thinking about projects that might follow the LHC. Many, more than a decade into the future, but people are now starting to sketch out ideas for a much higher energy proton-proton collider in a much larger tunnel. So the Future Circular Collider, as it is prosaically called, might be a 100-kilometer circular tunnel somewhere. Geneva is one possibility, but not the only one, which might host something like a 100 TeV collider, in contrast to the 13 TeV collision energy at the LHC. Whether that's deliverable engineering-wise and cost-wise remain to be determined. The engineering challenges are not least around building sufficiently high field dipole magnets to contain that energy of beam, even in that very, very large circular tunnel. And that would require, 16 to 20 Tesla dipole magnets in contrast to the 6 to 8 that is current state of the art. So that's new materials, high temperature superconductors, a lot of engineering challenges around high field magnets. Historically, that's an area that the UK has had a lot of strength in, but we have allowed it to dissipate because of personnel, key personnel moving on, and lack of funding for those particular challenges as we focus more on electron linear machines. And we may wish to revisit that and think about building up some capability in those areas. That's perhaps a little bit outside the scope of this meeting, but it's a thought. And then finally, the International Linear Collider, or the CERN Linear Collider, or Compact Linear Collider CLIC, are potential ways to deliver a high-energy electron-positron collider. I think the probability of either of those things happening is now diminishing. We keep in touch. We have some key contributions to the design studies for those machines. If a change of heart were to occur that made the construction of such a thing happen, for example in Japan, we would want to be part of it, but we wouldn't invest a lot in advance of knowing that. And we do maintain a portfolio of novel approaches that go beyond the things that you can actually imagine doing a costed design study for. So we have invested quite substantially in a project called MICE, which is shown here on the left to convince you it is a real thing. MICE stands for muon ionization cooling experiment. It's an attempt to demonstrate that you can produce muons, unstable secondary particles, and corral and focus that beam, cool the beam into a small fraction of phase space, which is not straightforward. And this is a project which involves RF technology, superconducting magnets, liquid hydrogen absorbers. So it is really an engineering testbed, and it's proved to be, if we're honest, a harder and more challenging engineering testbed than anyone would have thought when it started. We are seeing MICE through to the point where it demonstrates that this can be done. Currently, there is no project foreseen to take this technology forward, but there is a resurgence of interest in what such a thing might be among certain areas. CERN, for example, is starting to think again, that might lead to using muons as an alternative to electrons in a future high-energy collider. If that were to happen, we're quite well placed to contribute, but as I said, currently we're focusing on getting some physics results out of this experiment, and then that strand will depend on others to take forward. Laser plasma accelerators. Now, I've been slightly cheeky here, or confrontational perhaps, by saying, this feels a little bit like nuclear fusion to me, in the sense that it's always interesting, but it's always decades into the future. None of the things that I've described so far could really rely on a laser-driven accelerator to deliver with any sense of security. But the UK has demonstrated substantial capability in constructing plasma-based acceleration on a very small scale, on a lab scale, and this has generated high-profile publications like this front cover of Nature. We need to keep our hand in this game. Others are increasing their level of investment. For example, DAISY in Germany is starting a new and significant initiative here. CERN is also. And I think we do need to develop a more coherent and coordinated approach across the UK, because up till now, this has been very much driven by individual academic proposals to do individual projects, to write individual papers, and it has not, therefore, given us a coherent position that reflects the level of investment and capability that we really have. I do not think this is the route to a FEL, certainly not on a timescale that we'd be interested in having. It might be the route, however, to compact X-ray sources that have industrial application. It might be the route to things that are portable and usable, because compactness is one of the key attributes of this. But I don't think you could build something that produced a high enough quality beam to give you a very coherent and bright X-ray source from an undulator this way yet. So let's think about continuing this in a more coherent way, and we are indeed thinking about how we can corral the various strands of academic interest in this area in something that looks a bit more coherent, to use an accelerator-based pun. Another aspect that we mustn't forget is that your license to build an accelerator is your ability to stop the beam, both in terms of safety, but also because you often use the beam to generate secondary particles. And I've talked about neutrinos and neutron sources, both of which are key applications where all you do with the proton beam is ram it into a solid object, and then you get interested in the secondary particles that are thereby produced. We in the UK are world leaders at the development and delivery of these very specialized targets that can absorb megawatts of beam power without splitting apart, without destroying themselves under radiation damage or exploding. If you stood in a megawatt proton beam, you would not be there. But we have to build graphite or metal objects that do, and that dissipate the heat, and that maintain their crystal structure. Up till now, at least, that's been the way to do it. In future, that may not be possible, and there's interest in liquid targets, in rotating targets that will dissipate the heat load or the charge load over a much larger area. And one possible approach is the development of powder targets or very tiny bead targets, and that's something we've been working on. And this shows an STFC-funded experiment that's been carried out recently at CERN, where a proton beam was impinged on a tungsten powder, and I think this is a spectrum of size particles of known size, and in a vacuum, beam came in. This is a high-speed camera photo showing the blow-up, the physical, the powder just goes woomph. And that is driven, it turns out, by the electrostatic forces. So the charge from all of the protons that impinge on the target is transferred to the target objects. They repel each other. And therefore, if you were to build a target out of this thing, you wouldn't just have to deal with the thermal shock and the radiation damage, you'd have to deal with this electrostatic effect as well. And I think that's surprising and interesting, and something that we'll need to understand. So you can see the different sizes of particles that are involved here. And of course, the smaller particles are more perturbed. Now, all of that was about accelerators driven for future facilities and R&D that might underpin things beyond that, which was the first bullet point on my technology strategy. But we are aware, and we want to increase the take-up of this kind of technology outside the science domain. In fact, there are tens of thousands of particle accelerators deployed in industrial applications already. When we come up with new techniques and new capabilities, we'd like to maximize the spin-out of those things, both to commercial applications and in addressing important global challenges like healthcare, security, etc. But I wouldn't say we're going to invest in those to the extent that it would get in the way of building a future science facility, because at the core, we think that these future science facilities are the source of our innovation. So just to reassure people who are thinking, well, we're going to stop doing Clara because we're going to do some work on a medical accelerator. No, the priority is clearly enunciated. We should identify opportunities where they occur, and we should invest enough to get others to co-invest along with us. So industry partners, I hope you're hearing that. The drivers for industrial applications or for commercial applications or non-science applications of accelerator technology are very different. What I've talked about in the science applications are quality of the high energy, for example, ability to handle very high luminosities, ability to deliver very high magnetic fields. The drivers for industrial use are almost the opposite. You want it smaller, cheaper, less challenging, more efficient, more reliable. We all want improved performance, but what we mean by performance is perhaps defined a little bit differently. And for an application, you want to be able to come in the morning, turn it on, and have it work. Think of the X-ray source in your dentist's chair compared with running a synchrotron light source for science application. We need simplicity of operability, repeatability, and increasingly smaller and cheaper means portable. Security applications, medical applications, you don't want a thing that has to sit on a great concrete plinth and where the patient, for example, in a hadron therapy, is a very small part at the end of a very large piece of equipment. You would like it to be designed around the patient rather than the patient designed around the equipment. So all of these are challenges, and they drive things in a slightly different direction, but they require R&D nonetheless. Now, finally, just to say a little bit about where all of this happens, the UK has invested over the past decade and a bit in re-establishing or in growing an academic community around accelerator R&D in partnership with our national laboratories. And that's a really good example of that here at Daresbury with the existence of the Cockcroft Institute, which brings together Liverpool, Lancaster and Manchester, as I said, with a physical location here and strong partnership with the Accelerator Science and Technology Centre within STFC's national laboratories. The Harwell site, where the Rutherford Appleton lab is located, is also a base of accelerator R&D, and I showed you FETS and MICE and ISIS there. But we also have the John Adams Institute, which is, again, another university collaboration based at Oxford and Royal Holloway with the involvement of some Imperial College staff. So across the UK, there are centres, not nearly as many as we have universities, but we are clearly involving a significant subset of our university partners in the development and R&D towards this program. So just to wrap up, we have a strategy for accelerator R&D. We understand, I think, what we're trying to achieve with it. We see it as a driver for discovery facilities, which require technology and engineering development. So it's great to see so many people interested in doing that. We want to maximally exploit our current investments through accelerator R&D. So our current accelerator-based facilities are not static. They will require upgrades to the lattice, to the magnets, to the linacs, to the way that we handle the beams. We've identified an RF-based free electron laser as our highest priority for a new accelerator-based facility. These require investments in new R&D and in new capability with, in some cases, existing facilities. I've talked about maintaining a continued interest in more novel accelerator technologies as well. I've talked about ESS and XFEL as major new commitments to new international facilities. It's unfortunate that neither of them, the phase in their development at which the UK was able to commit to join is one where a lot of the accelerator engineering has already been put in place. That doesn't mean we can't contribute it, and we are contributing to it, but we are perhaps contributing to it a little bit less than we might have hoped. So we'll hear about that later. Limited scope for involvement, not zero. Place is a consideration. Here we are in the Northern Powerhouse, as politicians talk about it, and we in STFC see Daresbury as an important node for accelerator R&D within the UK. And Cockcroft, Aztec, the investment in Clara, and so on are part of that. And I think that's a politically useful thing to be able to say at this time and place. Doesn't mean that all of our accelerator investments will forever after be here, but it's not a bad thing that we can point to this key capability, and we intend to maintain that. And finally, and again, just to be a little bit provocative here, if it were ever the case that we had to choose between a major R&D investment in support of a future UK-based facility or a major R&D investment in support of a future European or international facility, in my role as CEO and accounting officer for £500 million a year of public spending, I would have to prioritize the UK-based facility, because if we didn't, nobody else did. So that's not a question that this thing is always a higher priority than that thing, but it says we are the stewards collectively of UK capability in these big science areas, and we're going to need to maintain that. So that gives some clear steer as to where the focus of some of our accelerator effort is going to go. So there you are. That's all. I have tried to, as I said, put some content in here and put some actual guidance as to where we see the priorities going. I hope I haven't undersold the fact that this is extremely exciting, interesting, and important. I hope you're here because you already believe that. We certainly do. We see accelerator capability as not just a necessary piece of engineering to deliver the science that we want to do, but inherently scientifically interesting in itself. And a lot of the challenges that we face are interesting things. When we have staff forums in this room, as many of you regularly know we do, we talk about the accelerator challenges because they're one of the key drivers and one of the key interests and one of the key areas where we can contribute. And it's sort of core to what STFC does to maintain that capability in the engineering and technology that underpins these areas of big science. So thanks very much.
question to John.
What level of buy-in do you think we have from BIS to our strategy?
BIS.
Who give us the money?
BIS give us the money. So for those of you not steeped in the politics of science, BIS is the Ministry, Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. As you may have noticed, we had an election last year, and now we've got a government spending review, which means that all departments are arguing for their future budgets. And I'm going to say something which I think is kind of known, but is perhaps a little bit semi-confidential. The Secretary of State in BIS is quite a Thatcherite, and we haven't heard that for a while. He has a portrait of Margaret Thatcher over his desk. So he doesn't necessarily think that government spending is in itself a good thing. But he is pretty clear that science spending is a good thing. That's not the same as saying that he will give us a blank check for all the stuff that I've written down here. He's not saying, here's £500 million, build a free electron light source starting now. But we are in a rather better place than we perhaps have historically sometimes been in terms of support for investment in big science capabilities. We have the money for ESS, for XFEL, for the Square Kilometre Array, which is a big telescope project. All of those things have been confirmed, and all of them are increases in our budget. We also know that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has met with BIS and has said reputedly, I want you to cut the budget of your department by a lot, but I don't want you to cut science spending at all. So we'll see how far that goes. But again, it's not the same as here's a check for £500 million, build us a new light source. But it's a lot better than I was afraid we might be. So we shall see. But BIS are, they're trying to figure out how to make radical changes to the way they operate outside the science area while maintaining the science bit. You can imagine the tension that creates within the department between the sciencey bits and the businessy bits, and the businessy bits always thought that they were doing what government wanted, and suddenly government's changed and they found they haven't. So even though it's the same Prime Minister, it's a different Secretary of State there. It's not Vince Cable anymore. And, the priorities have shifted, not for the science part, but for the rest. So I've probably told you way more than you needed to know in answering that question. But basically, science is liked by the Chancellor. Science is liked by the government. They're just not quite sure what they need to do to support it appropriately. So that's the message we're trying to get through, is you need to spend at the appropriate level. You need to invest in the following things. You need to give us more than just 2 and 6pence here, but we are seen as a good thing.
Okay. One more question.
What do you think would be the effect of the UK withdrawing from the EU on STFC?
That's an easy question, surely.
It wouldn't be good. I don't think many people are going to go into that. Maybe this room is an exception, but most people, when the referendum comes along, are not going to go into the voting booth and decide whether the UK should be part of Europe or not based on what's good for science. That's a shame, because I think being part of Europe is clearly good for science. It's not just being part of the EU, but if we were to withdraw from the EU, we'd be far less trusted in organisations like CERN. It would be far harder to work with other partners like the Swiss, even though they're not part of the EU, because it would be seen as the UK bringing up its drawbridge. And one of the reasons why people might want to withdraw from the EU would be to impose new immigration restrictions. Those would immediately harm our ability to bring and recruit foreign students. I mean, you can see people who look like you might have come here from overseas, I don't know. But there are, we are dependent on the internationalization of our science community. Our universities recruit very widely. All of that would be harmed. So it's not just our membership of organizations, it's the whole scientific culture of this country. So vote wisely.
Okay, John and Susan have got to get to Liverpool now. We've got to get going on. So thank you very much for a very interesting talk.